So we're now going to add some uniform rows, and we're going to be using, we could use the color channel, and we could multiply, or we could use a bump map, depending on how far away you're going to be from the material. We could also use a combination of both. I'm going to go ahead and just condense some of these so that the function isn't getting so large. This line group here doesn't really need to be modified, so we can change that too. Offset for our color. So let's just use a multiply for the color to add in our lines, and then we can start messing with the bump. The one thing about using the bump, and actually the color too, once you get into very small, thin lines, is you do have to increase the render quality once you start rendering the output in order to make it look good enough. Otherwise, you're going to get some really weird looking artifacts. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But what I want to do is use the vector in order to create lines. So what we can do is first I'm going to add a multiply by a constant. So math multiply by a constant, connect that to the position. This is going to give us an overall scaling for the crop rows. And then we're going to use the vector scale with a filter in order to create the actual row. So what we need is a math node and vector operation decomposer. We're going to use decomposer 3, which breaks apart a vector into 3 individual numbers. So x, y, and z. We're going to go ahead and use the x. Go to filter, just a regular filter. Connect that to x. And since we're going to be multiplying this with our color variation, we can go ahead and add in combiner, blender, 0 for the color variation that we set up earlier. Oh, and right now this is still in numbers, so we do need to convert that over to color map. So I'm just going to copy and paste that gradient I made before, connect it to that, the blender, and we're going to multiply just to darken it a little. And then we'll go ahead and change our output, so now we can start to see that line. So right now it's just one line because our filter is set up for the clamping mode, or it's not clamping, continue. So it's just going to continue along with very large numbers. It's just, if we take a look at the scale up here, we can see when we zoom out, like -160 on the side, 160 on that. It's just a big gradient, essentially. Just a linear number because it is the vector. What we want to do is repeat that. So we're going to set it to repeat. And now you can kind of see those lines showing up. But it's really just kind of a gradient. So what I want to do is we're going to add in and essentially just shape out the row. So we'll take this point on the right, -1 and 1, and bring that down here. So whatever size you want the rows to be, and we could make the spacing a little less if we wanted to just pull that out. Now, if you want this to be more of a gradient and not just flat, we could set this on curve. And then we'll have to add in a few more points here. If you want that fall off to be a little better. And that'll be better in some cases for the bump. And we We can make that a little more symmetrical. And I'm going to adjust the curves. I want to see the outside. And we can see how it is repeating over and over. So that's what we're going to get continuously throughout. We zoom in, and we should start to see that showing. Now, as it's refining, we can really see how small those lines are. And actually, if I multiply this, it's going to just make them even smaller. So what we really need to do is to divide it. And because view starts to get a little weird when you have too many decimal places, what I'm going to do is just set up division using a couple of numbers. So let's go ahead and right click, add a constant number. And this is going to be how much we want to divide by. I'm going to say 14 just to start. So what we need is another constant number 1. And we're going to do 1 divided by this amount and then multiply it by that. So we can go to our combiner, go to divide. 1 divided by 14. It's going to give us our output that we can use. And go here to the multiply by, right click on the multiply by, connect the parameter, that's going to extract it, and then we can multiply by the output. So now we can enter in a value. It's a little easier to control this number here in order to increase the scaling. So let's bring it up to 100. And now we can start to see those rows a little better. Now if you notice, they're all going in the same direction. So we do need to vary that, unless you want everything kind of going the same way, but that doesn't look very good. It doesn't look very realistic. I just want to zoom in a little and make sure it looks like we're still maybe a little too small. We might just need to do a render. And it looks like that's just a problem with the preview, where it's keeping the lines the same size no matter what scale we have. But we can see that they are being defined there. So now, right now, these are a little large. If we wanted to make actual crop rows, we would have to go a lot smaller. But mainly I just want to keep this a little bigger for now, just so we can see the changes that are happening before we go ahead and scale it down. Also, all the crop rows are the same separation, the same size right now. We can also modify that individually based on these clumps. So, first thing I want to do is adjust our rotation. And we want to do this after our scaling. We're going to add in, go to Math Node, Vector Operation, and we're going to use the Axis Orientation Transformer. We're going to set it to degrees. And what we want to do is our direction. We're going to connect the parameter, and our direction is going to be that vector. And then we're going to control the angle using the clumps that we had before, controlling the color. So we'll set our angle to clumps, and then we're going to connect that filter to this. Now, because it's set to degree and the output of the clumps is only between -1 and 1, we're only going to have a little bit of rotation. We could change it to normalized, -1 to 1. and that will use that negative 1-to-1 output here for a full rotation. But if you want to be more specific about the degree amount, then you can set that to degree, and then use, let's see, filter. We can use a map, and then take our negative 1-to-1 value and set, say, 0 to 180. And that's going to give us 180 degree rotation, or we can go higher. So that way we can define it in a little bit of a higher range. But for just a quick setup, normalized should be good. So now you can see we have all these rows that are changing, starting to look a little more interesting. And we'll just take a look at that right now. And what I was saying before with render quality, you can see get some weird looking lines here, and that'll happen anything under superior, depending on how far away you get. And now to scale these lines a little differently so that each set of crops is not exactly the same, because we'll have different spacing for different types of crops. What we can do is modify this value here, our scale, by using the clumps as we did before, and we're just using this noise to really just control all of the different aspects. Rotation, color, and now scale. So what I want to do, I think the easiest thing to do is just to go filter, and we're going to offset the scale. Replace that with the offset. And then we'll use the offset amount using the clumps. And that's not going to give us much right now. If we need to control the scale more, because right now it's really just going to be basically a value of 2. So this will change from 49 to 51 with this offset change. And we want to increase that. We could, I think the easiest thing to do would probably just multiply the value. So we'll go to math and we'll multiply it by a constant. And we'll offset by that value. And then now we can set our range. And that should give us a better control of the scale. Now, because we're multiplying a value that is essentially in 2, because we have negative 1-to-1, now our offset range is 20. So we're going with an offset, and actually it depends on which direction. It should be going up and down equally with the multiply. And it is. Negative 10 to 10, so we're subtracting 10 and adding 10, so we have a value or range now between 40 and 60. So we can adjust the midpoint value by adjusting this constant. And let's see how that looks in the render, since that preview is kind of weird. And we do have some changes here. Now we just need to make sure that whatever our value is, it's not going to cause this to go negative. And I think what I'm going to do is add in a floor of 1, just so we don't get anything weird. Oh, and that actually needs to go after the offset. So we'll change that input. And before it reaches this divide, I want to make sure that it doesn't go below a value of 1. It could potentially crash or just cause some weird looking outputs. So now it will not fall below a value of 1. So then we can mess with this a little more without having to worry about crashing view or doing some weird stuff to it. Bring that down to 25, and that will scale everything down. And then we can bump that to 15, which is going to give us an overall value of 30, which would bring us down to the negatives, and we can see that happening when we have a value of 1. We're getting these large rows there, so maybe that is too much. We'll go back to 10. And it really just depends on the look you want. So now what we're, because before we have the multiply set up, we can make the rows darker if we want to see those better. If we just want a little bit, just multiply it a little. We could also use this to mix a different combiner or a different way to blend the colors, where we could make that a dirt color instead of just multiplying it. And then we can also use this just before the color map, that filter, in order to create a bump map if we wanted the rows to go in a little. And for that, we're going to want a much lower value, because if we connect the bump directly to it, it's going to be really high and really jagged. Without anything else connected to it, we'll go ahead and just raise or lower that down to 0.1, just a little bit of a bump. So here's a render at superior render quality. We can see the little bit of bump showing up in there. We could round these out if needed. You can go into that filter that you used to create the rows from the vector, and you could either set up a different filter for that that's going to repeat in order to create more of a curvature that's separate from the multiplied value. One thing I want to do is, right now everything is really straight. These lines are basically perfect. So there's another thing we can do to add a little more variance. Actually, I'm going to go through the color channel because that's set up the 2D view. And let's see. What we want to do is modify the vector before the decomposer. And we can add in turbulence, and we'll just do a simple turbulence, connect it in between here. And that might be too much, or it might remove what we're going for here. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And we're going to go before we modify the scale, maybe. It's hard to tell. We might have to use and pay attention to this render preview because turbulence nodes do not show up well in the function editor, the preview. So actually, I'll go back and let's just try that again and just pay attention to the render. and see what happens. It looks like we did lose that. So maybe we'll just offset it by turbulence. So we'll add in math node vector operation offset. Okay. And then we will control this offset, connect parameter, and then connect that to a turbulence. Just a simple turbulence. There we go. Now we can see that showing up over here. So that's going to work a little better. And then we can adjust the amplitude, and that's going to give us a much better idea. So right now, if we just want to do small amounts of turbulence on these lines, and it really depends on how close you're going to get to this. This is going to be better for farther away. But we could also set it up if we want a larger bits of distortion, and a little more wavy, and not going too high. And that way it's not perfect. And then we can manipulate that further with a larger turbulence, adding another offset to it if we needed to. So that way we could do the smaller rows, almost have there's plants on each row, and that's going to distort it a little, and then we could do a larger distortion to take care and mimic more of the landscape distortion. So in the render we can see we've got a little bit of a finer distortion, smaller. Actually, it's about mid-range. Taking care of the rows. So you can manipulate that and add different additional offsets if you want to control different levels of turbulence for larger areas or smaller areas. And with a simple turbulence, it's easy when you use the offset, because then you can adjust the amplitude overall. So it's somewhat starting to come together here. Right now it's still really more for distant viewing and not so much close-ups. It'd be good for aerial view. So now we're going to move on and take that portion we had before we pulled out for the ecosystem and the lines. We could use that within the material, like I was saying before, to add paths and roads and stuff, but I think I'm going to use it to create some tree lines.